Good morning, everybody. I am extremely glad to introduce this session on the future of carbon pricing. What could be this future? If you ask the economists, it should be bright. Most of them consider that carbon pricing is the best instrument to accelerate the energy transition. That's why, in its latest roadmap toward carbon neutrality, the International Energy Agency takes for granted that all the countries start to price carbon by 2025. But ask policymakers. The picture will be quite different. Most of them fear carbon price. Like the guy on the cartoon, who is afraid by the little mouse, the carbon tax, and ignores the dragon of global warming behind him. So the future of carbon pricing remains uncertain. To tackle this issue, we have the chance to welcome this morning three exceptional panelists. Beatriz Yordi has worked at the European Commission for years in the field of energy and environment. Today, Beatriz is director at the DG Climate Action, in charge of the European Trading Scheme. She is probably today the best person to speak about the future of carbon pricing in Europe. Professor Janet Milne is based at the Vermont Law School in the US, where she created the Environmental Tax Institute. She wrote a lot of papers on the subject and a major handbook. Janet is also a pillar of the annual Global Conference on Environmental Taxation. Her vision on the future of carbon pricing in the US will be precious. Stéphane Hallegate is a leading economist working on climate change for years. He worked on many issues like adaptation to global warming, poverty and climate change, and of course, carbon pricing. Stéphane is currently lead economist at the Worldbank, a perfect observatory to anticipate the potential of carbon pricing in the emerging world. We will start this session with Stéphane on the emerging world. Then we will listen at Janet on the US before coming back in Europe with Beatriz. During their presentation, don't hesitate to ask your questions using the command located in the toolbar. And now I pass the floor to Stéphane. Stéphane, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to participate to this session. Very happy to be part of that group, even though it has to be online only. My presentation will be about carbon pricing from a development perspective. So from the work we're doing at the World Bank in supporting countries in their development process, we're looking at climate change and climate policies in this framework of the toolbox that we use to promote good development. And of course, in that context, we want to put this slide, which shows the increase in emission over time and shows very clearly the need for more climate action in the broader context of all of the development challenges we have. And of course, in this broader context, climate is part of the picture, a big part of the picture, but only one part of this picture. And we're in also a very special time when the decline in the number of people living in poverty has been reversed for the first time in decades. We see in 2020 and 2021 a large increase in the number of people living in extreme poverty by more than 100 million people. We also have a huge increase in public debt, which will be a challenge for many countries and will constrain government's actions. And of course, we have all of the development challenges we've had for a long time. This map shows the access to sanitation, which is of course a priority for development and quality of life. And you see that in a continent like Africa, we're very far from universal access to sanitation facilities. So how do we see climate action in this broader context is, and what is the role of carbon pricing in that broader context is really important to look at. So I'll just use this new tool that we created recently. It's the carbon pricing assessment tool, an assessment tool that we co-designed with many different people and very closely with our colleagues at the IMF. And the goal of this tool is to look at carbon pricing as a tool to reduce emission. And here, just for illustration purposes, I'm showing some simulation of the effect of a carbon charge on China and on emissions in China, but not only as a tool to reduce emissions, also, for instance, as a tool to raise revenues. So I showed you this big increase in public debt. We expect a lot of countries to be looking for tools to consolidate their climate finance in the next decade. And of course, countries will have the choice between using environmental taxes and labor taxes or corporate taxes or any form of VAT type taxes. And here we're trying to look at carbon prices as one of the ways for countries to mobilize resources. And there is a growing literature showing that this tool is particularly attractive in countries with large informal economies because it covers the whole economy, but also in countries with low administrative capacity or large tax evasion because it's a tax if upstream is relatively easy to manage and to control. And there are also a growing number of papers suggesting that environmental taxes are less distortionary and are more, less negative on economic growth than many other taxes. So here we see a lot of potential. And just to illustrate one important aspect for countries struggling to raise revenue through taxes, tax evasion, even in high-income countries, is much lower for taxes applied to energy than in other categories of taxes. So we see that as a very strong argument for using those taxes in low-capacity countries and environments. Carbon pricing can also be a tool to contribute to other development goals. And here it really depends on what we do with the revenues. So of course there is a tension. If you raise revenues to consolidate public finances, you cannot use the revenues for spending, but some countries will clearly want to combine those different objectives and can, for instance, use parts of the revenues to strengthen their social protection system and to do more redistribution. And here again, it's an example where part of the revenues from carbon price instruments is used to boost cash transfers for the bottom 60% of the population. And what you see is that you can very easily make that instrument an instrument for redistribution, with the lower deciles being net beneficiaries, while most of the cost is supported by the richest deciles. We have big spending needs in countries. I showed this before, but at the moment, of course, health is in everybody's mind with the COVID-19 crisis. And just a simulation to illustrate the capacity of carbon pricing to help with other priorities. On this figure, you see the revenues from a $75 carbon tax in 2030, and on the y-axis, current public spending in healthcare. And for all of the countries at the bottom of this figure, the revenues from carbon pricing could more than double spending in healthcare. So it's not to say that all countries will want to do that, but it really illustrates the potential of this tool to help with other tools and to make carbon pricing a tool for development. And of course, there is this recent paper that was trying to compare revenues from carbon pricing with investment needs in infrastructure. And again, showing that carbon pricing might not be able to solve this problem, of course, but that carbon pricing and the revenues raised with carbon pricing can really help with other development priorities. Here, our objective is really to engage with countries talking about carbon pricing not as an independent climate policy instrument, but more in a discussion about the development path, the development pathways and their needs, trying to combine different objectives, different priorities, and find ways of making climate action contribute to development, contribute to poverty reduction, contribute to economic growth, and to the access to basic services, so that we can really like break this divide between development and climate action. One challenge, if you do that, so if you're trying to take carbon pricing and to put it in the broader context of development and the tax system, is of course to integrate those instruments with what exists already. So you probably have seen this type of figures. This is from the Worldbank carbon pricing dashboard, a dashboard that tracks carbon pricing instruments in the world. And you see here, you probably cannot read on my slide, but you have many countries with emission trading systems or carbon tax with prices ranging from almost zero to more than $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So we have those instruments which are called carbon prices. But if you look more generally at taxes on energy, and here I'm using the OECD taxing energy use report for 2 European countries, you see on the top, and for the road sector, on the top you see a country with a large carbon tax. I leave it to you to guess which country it is. And on the bottom, a country without a carbon tax. But if you look at the actual tax on diesel and gasoline, the country without carbon tax actually is taxing fossil fuels more than the country with the carbon tax. So here, what's really important if we're thinking about the impact on incentives and the impact on climate, is to look at the total framework and the total price system, looking not only at what has carbon in its title, so carbon tax, but also looking at all of the other taxes and subsidies, so that we can really look at what the consumers or the investor or the decision maker in a firm, the type of incentives they are facing. And I think this is a really big challenge that we face, because it's very difficult to separate in any objective and clean way what is a carbon instrument, a climate instrument, and what is the rest of the tax system. Those taxes on diesel and gasoline, for instance, are supposed to pay for many things. They are supposed to pay for the infrastructure, maintenance of the roads, but also include a lot of other externalities like noise, air pollution, accidents. And how do we separate those different rationales for taxation is a really tricky thing to do. So here, I think the idea is really to look at the carbon instruments, because it tells something about the momentum on those tools, but not to forget that we have to track what's going on the rest of the tax system in parallel. And here we see one of the challenges that we face. So on the left, you see this growing number of countries or jurisdictions creating carbon pricing through taxes or through emission trading systems. And on the right, you see how the combined effect of oil prices, fuel taxes, fuel subsidies is leading to an actual decline in the price of fossil fuel. So we have a lot of momentum on one hand, and at the same time, really the need to look at the broader picture if we want to be efficient and to create the right incentives. And I think this framing, looking at carbon prices as a development tool, but also looking at carbon prices as part of the very complex set of incentives and regulations and taxes in every country, is what really drove the report of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices to recommend to think of carbon pricing at the country level and as a development instrument designed from domestic needs and priorities, and to leave this question of the coordination across countries as a secondary issue. So the report of the Commission proposed these reference prices, saying that to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, we needed carbon prices around like $40 to $80 in 2020 and $50 to $100 in 2030, but stressing very strongly that there is no level that is bad, in the sense that the level that you pick will really depend on your domestic needs, the political contexts, and also how you decide to balance action between price-based policies and all of the other ways of doing climate action. So this for us is also easier to manage because it means that it's very easy to build carbon pricing action and the dialogue based on the country and government priorities, which makes it easier to engage with governments and to build tools that can create synergies. The other dimension that I wanted to touch upon today is the move from the idea that carbon pricing is this silver bullet that will solve all of our climate problems to this idea, which is not now completely part of the consensus, that carbon pricing is part of what is necessarily a relatively complex climate policy package. We have a good sense of what needs to happen to decarbonize the global economy. We know that we need carbon-free electricity. We know that we need fuel shifting, especially to electricity in end-use sectors like transport and heating and buildings and industries. We know that we need energy efficiency everywhere. And we know that land use will play a key role because we need to increase natural carbon sinks and preserve the environment. So to make that happen, it's relatively clear that carbon prices only won't be sufficient. And of course, one of the reasons is that decarbonization faces many obstacles. So we, in 2015, we proposed this screen to think about policy design, thinking first about whether people have the right incentives, and if this is really where carbon pricing plays a key role, because unpriced externalities, of course, create the wrong incentives. But we also mentioned that wrong incentives can be also linked to other issues like principal agent issues or government failures. But even if you provide people with the right incentives, with, for instance, carbon pricing, there is still a long road between right incentives and the right action. People need to be well informed. They need to know about existing technologies. We have all of these behavior and political economy issues. People prefer to use technologies they are used to. They have a network that they are working with that might not include the new green technologies. And of course, sometimes, even if the incentives are there, if you don't have access to finance, for instance, you might not be able to select the best technologies. And only if you have this full map from the right incentive to the right policy design, can you have the right decisions being made. And this takes much more than the right prices. And policies need to really look at this whole set of issues. I like to illustrate these needs with those MAC curves that were published in 2007, because it really shows why carbon prices needs to be complemented with other policies. So if you go back to 2007 and you look at this curve, you see some of the technologies that we see now being competitive even without a carbon price, and that we see as major tools for decarbonization, like solar PV or like electric cars, being on the right of this curve. So they were like expensive technologies that you would not have invested in very early on. And only because we had other tools like direct subsidies to technologies, feed-in tariffs, renewable mandates, were those technologies used, invested in, and these investments made the price of those technologies decline. And today we can use them at a very low cost. This really shows that thinking in terms of innovation and the potential of various technologies and some selected tools to make the cost of those technologies decline is really important and need to complement carbon pricing instruments. The other side of the curve was like energy efficiency in electronics in the residential sector, or like shifting light bulbs to LED. All of the things were negative costs at the time. So carbon pricing clearly could not alone trigger the selection of those technologies. So this illustrates the role of regulations and standards, which have played a key role, for instance, in lightning. And finally, the last set of complementary policies I wanted to flag is the role of infrastructure and land use. This is from a paper looking at the city of Paris, where we looked at how a carbon price was reducing emissions. This is what you see on the left. And you see that modal split, for instance, the fact that people would move to public transit or soft modes like biking and walking is playing a massive role in the reduction of emissions in response to carbon pricing. And this is illustrated on the right. The elasticity of emissions to the same carbon price is doubled if you have public transit available to people. But public transit is unlikely to just pop up because you have a carbon price. So it really suggests that if you combine your incentives with carbon pricing with direct investments to give people substitution options like public transit, you get much more out of your carbon price than if you have a carbon price only solution. And it also makes the implementation of carbon prices easier because you need a lower price. So to conclude, I want to finish on the demand we see coming from countries. We see a growing demand for technical assistance on carbon pricing, but it's mostly focused on the integration of carbon pricing with existing policies and taxes and with other instruments like direct investments or regulations. And of course, the major challenge we see is the political economy. And this will be a priority for us in the next month and years. And this might be a topic where we will be coming back to all of you looking for collaboration and help to solve this big problem. Thank you very much for your interest, and thanks again for the invitation.
Greetings, I'm Janet Milne from Vermont Law School, where I'm director of the Environmental Tax Policy Institute and follow carbon pricing issues closely from my academic seat. Christian, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this session. I've been charged with discussing carbon pricing in the US, and I approach this task with a sizable dose of humility. It's complex, and even in the calmest of times, it's difficult to predict the mercurial ways of politics. But with that caveat, I will focus on three prongs of carbon pricing. Direct pricing, of course, the most famous approach through carbon taxes or trading to internalize the negative externalities. Also, repealing existing subsidies for fossil fuels to correct the baseline price and ensure that we're not actually subsidizing negative externalities. And then also the climate-friendly tax incentives and other forms of subsidies, I'll focus on tax, that reward positive externalities. I'll address all three prongs. I think they're important, but particularly for the US plot. I'll sketch out the US carbon pricing landscape pre-Biden, then talk about President Biden's proposals, and offer some perspectives on what might lie ahead. Carbon pricing in the United States starts with the fact that the United States at the federal level has not used broad-based carbon pricing. President Clinton in 1993 valiantly tried to enact a broad-based energy tax, a BTU tax, not a carbon tax, but motivated in part by climate change. That effort failed, and a decade and a half later, Congress spent 3 years examining the cap and trade approach, which also fell short. Gas taxes in the US do not pick up the carbon pricing gap. The average state and federal gas tax nationwide is just 55 cents per gallon or 14.5 cents per liter, which is substantially below, for example, fuel taxes in the EU. But at the state level, some states have used their independent legal authority to pursue direct carbon pricing. In the northeastern US, we have what's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, affectionately known as RGGI, which has been in effect since 2009. It's a cap and trade system that caps carbon emissions from the electric utility sector. And some of the states in that region are also now considering the possibility of a parallel cap and trade system for the transportation sector. On the West Coast in California, since 2012, there's been a cap and trade system that now covers 80% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Quebec and province joins in that trading program, and the state of Washington in the northwestern corner of the US is on the cusp of joining it. But for both RGGI and the California cap and trade, allowance prices are relatively low. At the most recent auctions, the RGGI price was $7.60, in California, $17.80. Not near the EU ETS trading prices recently, which capped 50 euros in early May. So if you look at this map, you see that there are large swaths of the country that do not have direct carbon pricing yet. And at the federal level, we've instead chosen to rely heavily on tax incentives for climate-friendly activities. And that's a tradition that started over 3 decades ago. As one example, for the 5-year budget window between 2020 and 2024, an estimated $60 billion in tax benefits will flow out to climate-friendly activities such as renewable energy, new technologies, and energy efficiency. And in late 2020, Congress increased those incentives by another $10 billion. So clearly at the federal level, we have preferred the climate carrots rather than the stick of direct carbon pricing. Now enter President Biden, and here you see him being sworn in on January 20th, 2021. He's instilled new energy in the climate change agenda, or as he calls it, the climate crisis, a welcome change. He's taken the US back into the Paris Agreement. Starting on his first day in office, he's used his executive powers to advance the climate change agenda. Here you see 2 executive orders he signed the first week. And for example, he's reinstated a meaningful price of carbon, social cost of carbon, at $51 per ton. He's set strong climate change goals, net zero by 2050, carbon-free electricity by 2035, and a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. He's taken an unprecedented whole of government approach that builds climate into agencies' agendas government-wide. reinforced by high level positions that are new, such as a special presidential envoy for climate to lead international negotiations, John Kerry, and a national climate advisor for domestic agendas, Gina McCarthy, and a cabinet level national climate task force, a depth of commitment we haven't had before. He's building climate change into his jobs agenda, making it central to the economy. In his address to the joint session of Congress at the end of April, he said, quote, "For too long, we've failed to use the most important word when it comes to meeting the climate crisis: jobs, jobs, jobs. For me, when I think climate change, I think jobs." So he's merged the climate agenda into his Build Back Better program for the country. In April, he presented the broad contours of a $2.2 trillion American jobs plan, part of that Build Back Better agenda. It's an infrastructure plan, but he defines infrastructure broadly to include environmental infrastructure and climate. So climate is central to his agenda. Carbon pricing is just part of that plan. The program is broader, but I'll focus on carbon pricing elements. In his plan that he's released, he proposes repealing existing federal tax subsidies for fossil fuels. The Department of Treasury estimates that that repeal would mean that $35 billion would not flow to fossil fuel companies over the next decade. A major step forward, but not supported by the American Petroleum Institute. He also has proposed a broad array of tax incentives and other direct spending incentives for climate-friendly activities. On the tax side, for example, just to name some, tax incentives and rebates for people who purchase electric vehicles, tax credits for power lines to upgrade the grid, expanding tax credits for clean energy production and storage, tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration, tax incentives for renovating existing buildings for energy efficiency, and more, plus direct spending programs and regulatory measures, including a proposed federal clean energy standard. Specific budget numbers and policy details are yet to come, but one estimate suggests that the energy-related tax benefits will cost $400 billion over the next 10 years if adopted. So the message is clear. The president wants to invest federal dollars in green tax incentives and other subsidies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He's willing to spend to try to achieve our goals. And carbon taxes? The White House has sent some supportive signals, but nothing concrete yet. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said at her confirmation hearing before the Senate, "We cannot solve the climate crisis without effective pricing." The president endorses the principle that government should, quote, "hold polluters accountable." And in April, Special Envoy John Kerry said, quote, "President Biden believes that at some point in time, we need to find out a way to have a price on carbon that's effective." But the White House has not yet put carbon pricing, direct carbon pricing, on its short-term agenda. It's politically risky, but also President Biden has pledged that he will not raise taxes on people with incomes under $400,000. Nevertheless, the idea of direct carbon pricing is in circulation in Washington. During the last session of Congress, 13 carbon pricing bills were introduced, primarily calling for carbon taxes. They didn't go to a vote, but people are planting seeds. And this year, several carbon tax bills have already been introduced. So it's out there in the ether, just not yet on the explicit Biden agenda for the shorter term. So going forward, what might the future bring? And here's where climate policy meets politics. A major challenge for the president and climate advocates is that there must be adequate legislative support on Capitol Hill. The administration can do a fair amount through its independent regulatory authorities, but legislation such as carbon pricing will require legislative action. And on Capitol Hill, there's a slim majority of Democrats in both the House and the Senate. Unlike a parliamentary system, the president does not control the policy agenda as long as he's in office. He has to negotiate with Congress. Excuse me. Here are some slide shots that show you what he's up against. These are screenshots taken immediately after President Biden made that comment at the joint address to Congress about linking climate with jobs. Here you see the socially distanced audience. Immediately after he made that statement, Democrats on the right rose in applause. Republicans on the left sat silent. These events are partly political theater, but I think these photos may capture the challenge that the president faces. There are also procedural wrinkles to what faces the climate agenda on Capitol Hill. The rules in the Senate procedurally set a high bar for legislation, climate or otherwise, that makes it more difficult to advance legislation. So I'll take you on a brief procedural tour and then come back to the issue of carbon pricing. In the Senate and in Capitol Hill generally, we have something called the filibuster. A filibuster is a prolonged floor speech that can prevent a legislative measure from moving forward to a vote. Apparently, it's from a Dutch term in the 17th century for pirates. So through the filibuster, legislators can effectively capture or pirate a measure, moving it to the sidelines. In the Senate, that creates a problem. 60 senators can, out of the 100, can vote to prevent a filibuster. But that also means that if a measure has less than 60 votes, then it is subject to capture by filibuster. And so in the Senate, measures cannot easily pass with a mere simple majority. For the Senate today, that's an issue. The Senate is split equally, 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, with Vice President Harris able to break a tie. So if all the Democrats and the Vice President are on board, they still only have 51 votes. They need bipartisan support to overcome a filibuster. There have been discussions about whether to reform the filibuster rule to allow the measures to proceed on a simple majority. A controversial issue whether it applies to carbon pricing or not. But there's another rule that presents an alternative path. Measures that go through the budget process, what we call budget reconciliation, can pass with just a simple majority, 51 votes in the Senate. So that's an opportunity, possibly. So for President Biden and advocates of his agenda, they can either negotiate broad bipartisan support for a package, they can seek reform of the filibuster rule to get around the 60 vote hurdle, or they can advance climate and other measures through the budget process on a purely partisan basis if all the Democrats are on board. So what will happen this year? It's always dangerous and difficult to predict what will happen. I'm recording these remarks in early May. That's a month on the calendar, but is maybe more like a year in political life. A lot may happen or nothing may happen. We will see. But so far we know President Biden is negotiating on a bipartisan basis about his infrastructure and jobs plan. And some legislators on Capitol Hill are crossing the aisle to talk with each other. Republicans, by gross generalization, tend to define infrastructure narrowly, traditional roads and bridges. That's not good for a broad climate agenda. They also are concerned about President Biden's proposals about how to pay for his suggestions to raise taxes on corporations, raise capital gains taxes, and repeal subsidies on fossil fuels. Democrats generally support the climate cause, but there's no guarantee they will move in lockstep in terms of the scope of the infrastructure package, including climate, policy details, or how to pay for it. So there's not an easy negotiating road ahead, especially with the slim Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. My suspicion, but it's just a guess at this point, is that it will be difficult to achieve broad bipartisan support, at least 60 votes in the Senate, for an infrastructure package that contains substantial climate change incentives or measures. And that a partisan route through budget reconciliation may look attractive, but we will see. And I suspect that we will be tilting this year more toward the climate carrots than toward the stick of direct carbon pricing. But what about carbon taxes or cap and trade in the longer term? I said a few minutes ago, the Biden administration has not dismissed carbon prices. It's spoken favorably, but just not advancing it yet. International discussions about carbon pricing and border adjustments, where there is work going on in Europe, could influence US policies on direct carbon pricing. We will see what happens leading up to and coming out of the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow. And here at home, meanwhile, there is some bipartisan support for the tax and dividend or fee and dividend approach. The distribution of lump sum dividends can help address equity issues and concerns about raising taxes. But some conservatives who are lobbying for that approach also see the tax as a replacement for regulatory mandates, a bargain that will be difficult for climate advocates to accept. There's also the possibility in the future that the need for new revenue, whether for climate purposes or otherwise, can open the door for a carbon tax. Either way, I think that how the revenue from a carbon tax is used will significantly affect the shape of the carbon tax debate whenever that happens. And then as we look forward, there's the critical issue of the political balance, future elections. If the Democrats lose control of the House and or the Senate in 2022 with the midterm elections, President Biden will have an even more difficult time advancing the climate agenda. That may increase pressure for action this year or early next year. And the climate stakes are very high for the 2024 presidential election. Finally, as we look ahead, we have a steep hill to climb for 2030, 2050, and to reach our goals. Carbon pricing is not the only tool in the box. We have other techniques as well, but it's important. If we don't see significant federal action, then the states will determine whether we can meet our goals. Each will make its own decision, and that will yield a patchwork rather than a harmonized whole. So, to put carbon pricing issues in the US in a dangerously small nutshell in closing, President Biden has revitalized climate policy for carbon pricing in particular. The repeal of existing subsidies for fossil fuels is seriously on the table, as it hasn't been before. We're continuing our tradition of looking toward climate-friendly subsidies through the tax code and otherwise using the carrots, but we're still a bit shy about using carbon taxes, at least as the opening gambit. I hope that will change. We will see what happens. I very much look forward to talking with you shortly when we have the live Q&A session and discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be virtually with you. We are in fascinating times for climate change policy in general, for carbon pricing in particular, in this global green momentum and difficult COVID times. We have an increasing number of jurisdictions that are committed to climate neutrality by 2050, including the EU, South Korea, New Zealand, and high political pledges like made in China, US, and Japan. It is crucial that these pledges are translated into action because science and experience tell us that we cannot afford to wait any longer. In Europe, the pandemic has not changed our ambitious climate agenda, and I'm particularly proud of that. The European Green Deal remains our top political priority and our recovery growth strategy for the future. In a major first step, the EU has laid down its commitment to climate neutrality in binding legislation. We have a political agreement on a climate law that it was reached on the 21st of April. This law includes the update of the EU 2030 target for net emission reduction for at least 55% compared to the year's 90s. The climate law is a law of laws and will guide all our policies over the next 3 decades. But targets are not naturally achieved. They are not achieved by themselves. We are now putting in place the concrete policies to deliver this real emission reduction. Before this summer break, the Commission will present its Fit for 55 package. It involves an overhaul of almost the entire climate acquis, the entire climate legislation, and more: taxation, renewable energy policies, energy efficiency, and sustainable transport. An important piece of this puzzle is the emission trading system, which prices carbon emissions in the power sector, the industrial sectors, and the intra-European aviation. Let me pass one main message. The ETS is working well. Trust in the carbon market is there, and so are price signals. As a result, impressive emission reduction in the sector's cover are being achieved. Carbon prices have steadily increased since the 2018 revision of the ETS, which, among other reforms, further addresses the long-standing surplus of allowances. This increased ambition for 2030 and the commitment to achieve climate neutrality as laid down in the climate law I refer to set out a clear direction of travel, which further builds trust in the market. Today, prices are around 50 euro per ton, and they are driving real emission reduction on a daily basis. Let me share with you our latest data based on verified emissions submitted by all the installations, around 10,000 installations around Europe. These data show that in 2020, ETS emission reduced by 13 compared to previous years. And more important, in this previous year, in 2019, emissions have been reduced by 9%. Of course, 2020 was a special year, unfortunately, a special year, and reductions have partially been driven by COVID-19. This is true for aviation, where emissions reduced by 64% due to the enormous industrial tough times that we experienced. But carbon prices have recovered remarkably well and quickly from the first shock caused by the initial lockdowns in April 2020. Within 1 month, the price was back to its pre-COVID level. The power sector was the driver of this decarbonization. Power sector witnessed a 15% decrease, reflecting both reduced electricity consumption due to the pandemic, but certainly also to the previously identified trends, like the switch from coal to gas, power generation, and the replacing of fossil fuels by renewable energies. Emissions from industry decreased last year on an average of 7%, with an unfortunate GDP reduction of 6%. Let me mention as special sectors that have reduced, like iron and steel, cement, or chemical. With current data, it's not yet possible to determine what proportion was due to increased emission efficiency and what proportion due to the pandemic, but we see a trend to start reducing emissions. The ETS is delivering real reductions, sending an increasingly relevant price signal for the long-term investment. However, current legislation is not sufficient to achieve the emission reduction necessary to meet the EU-wide target of 55% reduction by 2030. And this is the main reason why we are revising the ETS. Let me share with you what is this revision and what it is on the table now and what we will present before this summer. Two main pillars of this revision: strengthening and extending. Strengthening, the main purpose of this revision is to bring the environmental contribution of the ETS in line with the 55%. In essence, means lowering the cap. In a cap and trade system, the cap ensures that emissions are cut by the necessary amount. And there are different ways of lowering this cap, or a steeper linear reduction factor, or a combination with rebasing. And these design choices need to be seen in a context of how this affects all the building blocks of the carbon market: carbon leakage, or market stability, or revenues, or distributional effects. Let me start with the protection against the risk of carbon leakage. Increased carbon leakage is not only economical damaging, but also environmental damaging. Emissions are moved back or are brought to jurisdictions with laxer climate policies. So the Fit for 55 package will include an assessment and proposals to ensure that our main existing leakage protection, what we call the free allocation of allowances, remains fit for purpose. We have always protected vulnerable industries and will continue to do so. As part of this future carbon leakage protection, an alternative exists, which is why the Commission will also propose a carbon border adjustment mechanism for selected sectors to avoid that our increased ambition is undermined because other jurisdictions do not follow. We will also propose to revise the Market Stability Reserve, but there is no need for a complete renovation, as the evidence shows that the instrument is working well, very well, and feedback received in the public consultation confirms this. Any amendment will be made to make sure it can continue to fulfill its objectives of addressing the surplus, ensuring a healthy degree of liquidity in the market, and improving ETS resilience to shocks in demands. Finally, in this revision of the ETS, let me mention the increasing the ambition of the ETS has impacts on distributional aspects which are essential. We will look into how to tackle that. We will look to how to ensure a just transition, and also how the Innovation Fund could support breakthrough technologies that are needed to become economically viable. The second part of the revision of the ETS, I mentioned just the strengthening, is the extension to new sectors: road transport, buildings, and maritime. The communication on a stepping European ambition adopted in 2020, it says clear that expanding the emission trading can achieve additional greenhouse emission reduction at EU level in a cost-efficient manner. Let me reassure you, introducing carbon pricing will not mean abandoning all sectorial policies of these sectors. It will mean reinforcing them. And it will be part of an additional, ETS will be part of an additional instrument in a basket of policy tools. We are well aware that the regressive social impact that carbon pricing could have needs to be balanced. And thirdly, let me tell you that we will be carefully in not distorting the existing carbon market, which is working very well. Where these framework conditions are met, we believe that carbon pricing can make a difference in these new sectors. And this is why we were also proposing to integrate maritime emission into the ETS. Let me just tell you, we see that the ETS is ever more capable of driving incremental emission reduction. Looking to the future, the big question is whether it can trigger the investment decisions in breakthrough technologies that are needed. There are many promising technologies when we look at the 2050 horizon, and they are, for example, in the steel, cement, and chemical sectors, but they can have marginal abatement costs that are still well above the current carbon price. A rise in carbon price helps a great deal to improve the business case of such technologies. Is technology neutral, and let's market decide which abatement choices. But bringing down the cost of these technologies helps. So this is why initial public support for a first commercial deployment is crucial. Revenues from the ETS can be put in good use. Good use meaning innovation, which grows bigger with the carbon pricing, also via recovery fund or other funds like the Just Transition Fund or state aid. We are considering the Commission developing a carbon contracts for difference as an instrument to de-risk or to take out the risk of carbon price uncertainty and to ensure return on first commercial deployment of proven but not yet competitive new technologies. A European approach would ensure scale and competition. Furthermore, the Commission is working on developing a regulatory framework on the certification of carbon removals. We know this is going to be part of the 2050 horizon. A high carbon pricing and solid support are just two elements of the framework to deliver net zero industrial emissions. We know that circularity, product standards, the creation of demand and lead markets for low carbon products have also the role to play. Throughout this journey, it will be paramount to ensure the transition is a fair and social one. And let me conclude. The ETS is one piece of an ambitious climate agenda, but a crucial piece. Including the building and transport sector would mean covering around 75% of total European emissions. We have learned from experience and are now ready to reinforce the system further, enabling industry, power sector, and citizens to deliver the emission reduction we ask from them in a cost-effective way. Many thanks to you all.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Do you hear me? Yes? Okay. Sorry for this difficulty to organize a meeting with this distance, but I will try to do my best. I was very impressed by one convergence in the three speakers' presentations. The three speakers told us carbon price is important, but carbon price isn't the solution. It's just a part, a contribution to a more global project, which is the decarbonization of the economy. And Stéphane started telling us that, of course, development is huge priority for many less developed countries. And maybe decarbonization and carbon tax can make sense only if it's included in those with those targets. Janet told us that in the US today, the question is how to combine low carbon transition with jobs. And finally, Beatriz told us that, of course, ETS is a main achievement in Europe, but it's not all the policy, the climate policy in Europe. We need to incorporate this instrument in a broader vision. So thank you very much for those three very interesting presentations. And now I will ask who has a question to raise. And I have a first question coming from the network to Stéphane Hallegate, thank you for this overview of carbon pricing. If I continue your metaphor, the road from carbon price to policy visible impact is long. How to support policy makers, and also how to integrate carbon price into the water, energy, food, and how to make them to exacerbate, not to exacerbate market distortion and inequity in income distribution. So Stéphane, are you online?
Yes, hello.
Stéphane?
Yes.
Can you answer this first question, please?
Yes, I mean, I can. I mean, the first part is whether this is a long road. And I think maybe yes and no is a good answer to that question. Yes, because we're very far from having the type of levels of carbon prices that would really make a difference in terms of emissions and technologies and behaviors in most of the world. But at the same time, no, because a lot of countries already have fuel taxes, which in a way are the same thing, just supposed to finance other priorities and calculated with other ways. But it's not a huge amount of work to just, in a country with fuel taxes, to create this additional instrument. And as I think I said in my presentation, a lot of countries are looking into it because they see that as maybe a good way to deal with the current situation of very high public debts and at the same time huge priorities for public spending. So I think we could see a big change very quickly in the next years. How to make sure this comes as a support to development, as a support to poverty eradication. It doesn't increase distortions. Well, it's always the same thing. Like everything is in the design, especially in the use and the recycling of the revenues, that they have to be used in a way that is efficient, combining an efficiency criteria with also the complicated political economy that sometimes part of the spending is going to make the reform more acceptable. So I think that there are some risks, like with every big reforms, that the money might be poorly spent, and we have to just try to provide all of the advice we can to make sure governments are doing that as well as possible and are very, very cautious of using these additional revenues in a good way. But there is nothing written in stone about that.
Stéphane, may I ask you a question? Do you have examples where it already works, or are all these studies just on the future or on the potential, what could be done in the future? Because I'm very surprised at the map you presented that in most of the countries, when you have carbon price, it's usually in developed countries and not in developing countries.
Well, actually, what we see the most in low and middle income countries at the moment is fossil fuel subsidy reforms. So you start from a negative carbon price and countries are moving to removing it. And I think it's a very good example because you have some countries like Indonesia who did the fossil fuel subsidy reforms combined with a buildup of social protection to make sure it doesn't increase poverty or make the life of the poorest more difficult. You have countries like Ghana who did it with making schools free. So they removed the fossil fuel subsidies, but they removed the fees for the schooling, which is another way of giving the money back in a way that contributes to poverty reduction and development. So we see, I could give examples, but as you noticed, in developing countries, we're more talking right now about making the carbon price non-negative and not really going into the positive side of the story. But there is a transition and these things take time and we're going there.
Okay, I have a question coming from the audience, Stéphane. How do you estimate the risk of planning infrastructure investment on carbon tax revenues that eat up their basis? So they might be quite volatile and decrease with decarbonization.
Well, so what is supposed to happen is that the carbon price should increase over time to contribute to the decarbonization of the economy, and at the same time, the emissions should decline. So the effect on revenues is the balance of this increasing price and decreasing emissions. If you look at scenarios and numbers, it's true that if you arrive in 2050 with zero emissions, you have zero revenues. At the same time, I mean, in a way, like we'll solve that problem when we get there, right? It's really not the problem just right away. If you're looking at projections for the next 10 to 20 years, you have a relative stability because those two effects compensate each other. So it's a very good point that this will happen. But because the timescales are very different, I don't think it's an argument against it now. But of course, this is something that will have to be managed exactly in the same way that countries rely quite a lot on fossil taxes at the moment, and this will also create a problem for the tax base. Nothing new here.
Especially with the gasoline and the electrification of road transport. Janet and Beatriz, do you have a question for Stéphane or not?
I would just say that I really appreciate your perspective of the country by country approach, given different circumstances in different countries. And just to the north of the US, we have Canada, where a very interesting carbon pricing system has gone into effect. I think it's an example of starting with a province, British Columbia in 2008, which did a fantastic carbon tax. And then the federal government stepped in and said, we need a national price, but it gave flexibility between whether the provinces would create their own system or whether the federal, quote, backstop would kick in. And I'm curious, Stéphane, whether you see that model gaining momentum in the countries that you're looking at.
Excellent question. Stéphane.
Well, that's another of the examples we use quite a lot on how the recycling of the revenues is really like a big part of that story and can really help with acceptability and making the reform possible. But this is a very good point that sometimes you don't need to start with a national scheme. You can have regional ones. Sometimes you don't need to start with an economy-wide scheme. You can start with a coverage that is only partial. And of course, this in economic theory, this is anathema, right? Because you create distortions and it's really, really bad. So it's only if you start to think about the political economy and how do you get where you want to be that you can start to think about all of the cases where sacrificing a bit of efficiency in the transition just to make it possible to do it is really worth it. And a lot of countries, in China being a case in point, has created this emission trading system also only in some provinces, looking at how it works, whether the system was accepted and working before they decided to generalize. And this needs to experiment and to give local and national decision makers this space to try something without necessarily making it definitive or making it the final system will be really important as we decarbonize of our economies, because we'll have a lot of things to invent. We won't get it right every time. We'll make mistakes and have to correct them over time. So how do we create this spirit of experimentation, testing, validation, revision over time, and so on is for me a really, really important point. And from a sort of like expert perspective, also this humility that sometimes some of the recommendations doesn't really pan out as we expected, and we'll have to in our recommendation to put this idea of experimentation, testing, and revision really at the core of what we propose and recommend.
Thank you, Stéphane. Beatriz, any question to Stéphane?
So more than a question is a little bit of clarification, because I mean, many thanks to Stéphane and also to Janet for the excellent presentations. When Stéphane mentioned that carbon pricing, it is key in climate policy, of course we fully agree, and that it's not the silver bullet. Of course we fully agree. I think that it's a kind of unanimity. There is unanimity in whatever climate policy maker. But I think that the pandemic has shown that carbon pricing is not only carbon pricing, a climate policy, but it's also a big protagonist of this recovery. How this is a protagonist of the resilience and the recovery, not only sending the right signals to the society, but also being a possible income for this recovery and also fairness. I think that the fairness was in a Stéphane presentation. Just to say that in our European carbon pricing, we have modernization fund, which has been a first fairness between member states of lower income, that they can catch up in the decarbonization path. And what we will present on the 14th of July will be also social aspects as carbon pricing extended to road and to transport. It has it could have a bigger effect on fairness, and that's why we would like to actively tackle it.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. Stéphane, any remarks on this subject? Or I think you.
No, except that this is really great to see these concerns for the social impacts, the effect on poor people, and so on become the core of the discussion. I think it makes everything first much easier for people to discuss, because it's closer probably to their everyday concerns, and also we avoid this problem of giving the impression that we care about the long term and not about the short term. We have to be very clear that we also care about people's struggles right now, and that the solutions we're trying to design are solutions for the long and the short term, and not only for the long term. So if we could break this idea that there is this massive trade-off between short term and long term, showing that we can do both, I think this is a huge step into making climate policies positive, acceptable, and realistic.
Thank you, Stéphane. Janet, I come to your presentation, which was fascinating, and I'm always very interested when I listen to American colleagues that in the US, you always have this question of the president and the Congress in terms of climate change. It's a long story because it started 20 years ago. I had a first question. I understand that, in fact, the question of carbon tax in the US context will come afterward. Now the priority is investment and reduction in fossil fuel subsidies. I had a question on, is there among the Republicans, are there leaders who are in favor of carbon tax? In France, we had this information on the carbon dividend, and the former Republican leaders who were in favor of this kind of taxation. Is it really something which exists in the US, or all the Republicans are completely against climate change fighting and carbon taxation?
It's a mixed picture. Generally in the political framework, according to a recent poll from this spring, Republican voters are, as a general matter, much less inclined to have government address climate change issues, whereas Democratic voters are much more supportive, or Democratic leaning voters much more supportive of that. So we start with a kind of a popular differentiation in opinions. When it comes to the official Republican leadership, the leaders in key positions in the House of Representatives and the Senate, they are not favoring carbon taxes, and even are opposed to the idea of repealing subsidies for fossil fuels. So there's a clear kind of official current political statement. But under the surface of that, there are a number of Republicans who are interested in the concept. And so there have been bills introduced in Congress that are co-sponsored between Democrats and Republicans. So there's some bipartisan support. There's also a coalition, which includes a number of prominent Republicans from the past, that has supported the idea of a carbon tax and using the revenue for lump sum distributions, or quote dividends, back to the general public. And so that, some of the major fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, are and the American Petroleum Institute have come out with statements in favor of carbon pricing. So, and those tend to be more on the conservative side of the ledger. So I think there are multiple currents going on at different levels of the political system, the formal system and the informal system. So I think it's not strictly partisan, and it's a question of how in the long term those forces play out.
Thank you very much. And another question is that now we heard that the US has quite ambitious targets for 2030 and 2035. How is it possible to reach those targets without any carbon price instruments? Do you think it's possible? It's feasible? Or?
It's challenging, and I leave to the economists the idea of exactly which instruments have to contribute which shares. But under the current projections, by even without changes in policy, the US would have reductions of emissions of 26 to 28% by 2030. But the Biden administration has set up the goal of reductions of 50 to 52% by 2030. So that's a major increase over what we need to do under the baseline scenario. And that's where I think that the policy, that whether the Biden administration can get the policies it wants, is going to be critical to achieving some success toward those goals. For example, it wants to have a renewable energy standard for utilities nationwide. Now we have about 30 states who have standards for renewable energy for utilities at the state level, but having a national standard, which in fact many people support, would be critical. And I think that President Biden's emphasis on electric vehicles is important. His budget proposes $174 billion in incentives and various different programs to try to bring electric vehicles into a mainstream status over the next 10 years. And if that can happen, then it's easier to make the transition for the transportation sector. And of course, carbon pricing would help advance that transition. But if we can show people that alternatives are real and are feasible, that makes it easier, I think, also to make the case that carbon pricing can help be one of those complementary policies. But there are debates going on. For example, there's real split in opinion about whether we should be supporting carbon capture and sequestration. Progressives on the Democratic side don't think we should be advancing or enabling more fossil fuel usage. So that's a split even within Democratic circles. So it's going to be very, very challenging. I think there's no doubt about it. And the question is kind of how much can the current administration get done to try to make that transformational change in the way in which we conduct business.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. Stéphane, any question to Janet?
Yeah, actually, there is a question that that I've asked myself for a long time, which is whether the opposition to carbon pricing is mostly an opposition to gasoline taxes. I mean, what is the role of the transport sector in the opposition to the carbon pricing instrument? And therefore, one of the big question is, it makes sense to just start excluding that sector to get started, or did the country lose maybe like 15 or 20 years of using that instrument just because of this block in the transport sector?
It is very hard to raise gasoline taxes, the direct transportation fuel taxes. It's a political lightning rod, and they haven't been changed in about 2 decades, haven't been increased. But there is currently kind of some real increased attention to the fact that we need to find ways to subsidize the road system, which has traditionally been paid for with gasoline taxes. And yet there's still resistance to doing that. But interestingly, in the negotiations that President Biden is having with the Republicans over the infrastructure package, one approach that the Republicans say is, let's use user fees, and essentially kind of endorsing this concept that people should pay more for the services they're getting. But then Biden is caught by the fact that he has said we don't want to raise taxes on people with incomes of less than $400,000. And a user fee would do that if one interprets a user fee as a tax. So it's a really, it is a very sensitive tax issue politically because it's so visible. A poll this spring found that 70% of the population would be willing to have corporations pay for emissions, pollution emissions, through a tax, but at the same time, I think when it comes to paying the tax themselves, when they perceive it as a tax on them, it's politically harder. So I think you raise a very good issue of, do we move ahead on other fronts and come back to transportation in time? But it's still the largest sector of emissions in the US at 29%.
Thank you very much, Janet. I think we have come back to Europe. I had just one question from the audience. How does a carbon price in Canada fit into the US commercial agreement referring to carbon leakage? Can you just have a very brief answer to the question, which seems quite difficult?
The brief answer is I can't give you a good technical answer, but the Canadian system does has a specially designed provision for carbon intensive industries to avoid leakage. And I suspect that fits into the Mexico, Canadian, US free trade agreement, but I can't give you a precise answer. I'll look
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janet. And now we come back to Europe with Beatriz. Beatriz, I had a first question. Thank you very much for your very clear explanation of what the Commission is now doing, which is very important. And we have, of course, many questions to you. I had just one referring to the enlargement of the ETS. You said very clearly that it's important that opening the ETS to building and transportation shall not disturb the existing ETS. How do you imagine this ETS for road transportation and building? Would it be a separate ETS, or would it be like maybe in the aviation a kind of separate ETS but with some link with the existing ETS, or how do you see this? Because of course, as an economist, I think that having one ETS would be better than having several ETS.
Just thanks, Christian, for your question. Just to clarify, I am not very clear, if I could say, on the extension to building and transport, because we are still in an internal process. We have in the Commission, first, we need all the college agreement. It means a kind of European ministers, they need to agree on what is the outcome, and then we will propose to Parliament and Council to discuss. So I would have loved to be more clear and more in detail, but I cannot, simply as that. What I can say is that part of the political discussions and technical discussions, there's one principle that we should not disturb a market that is currently around 50 euros, that is decarbonizing impressively, that power sector is reducing around 15% in a row in the last 2 years. So it's giving the real clear signals. So it's a common sense approach that we will need building and transport is a big part of the economy, because we will be covering around 80% of nearly 80% of the economy. So to do it in a separate system, not yet confirmed because the proposal is not yet out, but the internal trend discussion is that we go to a specific different system for building and transport.
So with two prices, in fact.
On verra.
Thank you for this very interesting answer. Maybe Stéphane and Janet, do you have any question to Beatriz? Because I have many, but I don't want to speak too much on this issue, which is very important for me. Janet or Stéphane?
I think just to add that it will be very interesting to see what comes out of your deliberations this summer, and particularly from a US perspective on the border carbon adjustment mechanism, because I think that will have very interesting international dynamics attached to it. But you probably can't say anything more on it, but if you can, it would be very
maybe she can. Beatriz, can you tell us a little more about this carbon?
I will try my best with a little more. What I can say, well, of course, your question, Christian, on the different prices. If we are talking about different systems, it will be a different price. But as mentioned, I need to carry all the time this caveat of still an internal discussion. Listen, CBAM, it's a big. We put climate change in another international discussion. As you know very well, Janet, we cooperate with the Biden administration. There will be this upcoming next week US Europe discussion, the summit of 15th of June. So we have on climate, it's part of the agenda. So we cooperate a lot with the US, and we think that cooperation with New Zealand, Japan, China on ETS, so the carbon pricing, and we also cooperate, of course, with Worldbank in the carbon pricing leadership coalition. So carbon pricing is going, and climate change is going clear protagonist of multilateral cooperation. What details I can give on CBAM? Well, not more than that you already know. It is a climate protection, it's not a trade protection. This is our principle, WTO compatible. And the idea is, of course, to avoid that a cement plant goes to a third country that does not have the same solid climate policy as ours. Details, ways, I think, to be more prudent than I will wish.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left. Do you have a last word to say to the audience, Beatriz?
4 points. Carbon pricing is here to stay and to enlarge. Carbon pricing is not alone. We need other policies, clear, innovation, renewables, social policies. Third point, climate policies are confirmed from European perspective that they are a big part of the recovery policy and resilience, recuperation of the economy. And the fourth is, please stay connected for the 14th of July package.
Thank you very much. Janet, your last word.
Thank you.
Very brief.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I also wanted to add my thanks to Chiara and Gianluca and all of the technical people who put together this program, which is quite a feat online. So thank you to all of you.
Stéphane, your last word.
Well, many thanks to all of you for organizing. Maybe my last point is that between the net zero commitments that we have seen in recent months and the work going on pricing and other tools, the CBAM and the rest, I think that there is a very strong signal for all countries that we're going toward a fully decarbonized global economy. And this really contributes to action everywhere. So there is a lot of momentum at the moment, and this is very encouraging.
Thank you very much. It was a very fascinating session. Thank you to Stéphane, thank you to Janet, thank you to Beatriz. I learned a lot, and I think now carbon price is no more theoretical issues. It's a practical political issue. Thank you very much to all, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Big thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to you. Bye-bye.